Okay, so this is Elements 1, and this is your first lecture. And what we want to do is start with the big picture in a way, to talk basically about some of the bigger issues of design and perceptions and things like that. And then we're going to launch into kind of breaking down the various elements of design and defining them and so forth. So we start out with a question, and that question is, what is design? A lot of people have an idea about what design is, but it's a good and useful thing to actually level the playing field and everybody come from just the same understanding. It's kind of like in any race, everybody has to line up on the starting line, and those that don't line up on the starting line don't get into the race, or they lag behind or whatever. So what we're doing is we're putting everybody on a common starting line with these definitions. So design is a field of, we'll call it discipline or practice, and it is kind of wide open. There's a variety of disciplines within the design field. There's not just interior design, there's graphic design, which includes web design. There's illustration, which kind of bridges between design and fine art. There is industrial design, there's transportation design, there's fashion design, and so forth. So there's a bunch of different disciplines, and design is a big picture idea, and it's an umbrella over a variety of fields of practice. Getting down to the basics of what design is, we can call it the planned arrangement of elements to form a visual pattern. And basically design always has a visual result. There's a functionality to it, definitely, but there's always a visual result. It involves deliberate choices. It's not intentional, or it is intentional, it's not whimsical, it's not accidental, it's not just because, or just because it feels right or whatever. Design is very much a thoughtful application of principles and elements to form this visual result, this visual pattern. Another thing to look at is, what is creativity? A lot of people don't understand what that is either, and what we're looking at is the fact that creativity is actually inherent in human beings, no matter what field they're in, no matter where their interests lie. Basically, creativity is the ability to bring something into being. It's the ability to be innovative and original, to improve upon ideas, to look at something and see something bigger and better, perhaps. And creativity involves thinking, it involves looking at things, it involves an actual practical step of doing. Then this is the big issue. What is aesthetics? A lot of people come to the table with the idea that aesthetics is a subjective, personal preference. And if we take that understanding, then we basically lose the race from the very get-go, because if it's all subjective, there's no objective standard or criteria by which we can judge good design from bad design. And we actually need that, because we need to understand, we need to be able to evaluate our work in process and after the fact to make sure that it is sound, that it is true, that it is functioning properly, and so forth. And so the understanding of aesthetics as a field of study or as a set of principles is different than somebody's individual aesthetic. So the idea of aesthetics, as we are addressing them and studying them in class, is aesthetics is basically the theory of beauty. It is what makes something pleasing, compelling, attractive to the human eye. If design is a visual thing, it needs to have some attraction to it. Aesthetics involves the forms and organizing principles of design. The forms are those things that are tangible and visible. Like if we look at the ideogram here on the right-hand side, the forms are the black brushstrokes. And these actually represent and communicate something to who's ever looking at this and understands what is being said. One of the things also about aesthetics is that there's the issue of excellence. Since beauty is eye appeal, basically, not eye candy, but eye appeal. Excellence is involved. Things that are shoddy, that are lazy, that are kind of thrown together don't work and are not beautiful. And the other thing to understand about aesthetics is that aesthetics is objective, it's universal, it is, shall we say, true for all people in all places, in all cultures, at all times. And as we go through this course, that should unfold, and you'll see the foundation for that statement. A lot of people think that's a fairly radical statement for me to make, but if you look at the overall understanding of what aesthetics is, then it becomes very obvious that it is objective and universal, and it is a criteria by which we can measure good design versus design that, you know, doesn't measure up. Which leads us to the next question: what's the difference between aesthetics and style? We see before us a Mondrian, a Picasso, and a Kandinsky. And they are all very different stylistically, but each one of them is aesthetically sound. So style is not the same thing as aesthetics. A person's aesthetic, which is their style, their mode of expression, is not the same thing as the overall field or study of aesthetics. So there is a difference. And we can judge things on the basis of style, which would be subjective and therefore open to question, or we can judge them on the basis of aesthetics, the theory of beauty, which is objective and universal and not open to question. So style, then, or a person's personal aesthetic, is the manner and way that they apply the aesthetics. They take those forms, they take those principles, they put them together to create a visual result. A style indicates a designer. We can look at, let's say, Milton Glaser, who's a very well-known graphic designer, or William Morris is a graphic / illustrator / interior designer, was actually a period. So we can look at the Industrial Revolution, or we can look at Rococo. A place, there's the New York School versus the Memphis School, or a culture or movement. So styles actually define and reflect and influence cultures and movements, but it's not aesthetics. A style is also the distinctive appearance of a work that is determined by the principles according to how it's designed. In other words, Mondrian took aesthetic principles and did a real particular thing with them. Picasso did took those same principles and did something entirely different. And Picasso actually started out very figurative and then went very abstract throughout his lifetime. And then, of course, we can call something a particular category of form, like Western form, Eastern form, Baroque, things like that are styles. Things to keep in mind, things to consider. Design always has purpose. Design is not fine art. Design is not self-expression. The purpose of design is actually has nothing to do with the designer. The designer is the person who's actually creating the design, but the purpose of the design is for the entity or the person that the design's being created for. So it's not fine art, it is not self-expression, and that's really important to understand. Design includes a variety of disciplines, which I've already alluded to. design combines form and content. There are shapes and colors and textures, but then the content is what's being expressed, or what's the overall function or understanding of the design. When you're a designer, you're going to be looking at things, you're going to be understanding things. So there's a seeing and perception, there's an apprehension of, oh, look at that, and then a comprehension, oh, I see or I understand. And so the designer has to develop an eye for seeing things all the time, because we draw from our experiences and our environment and from history and from things we've learned and from other people's ideas and styles. So design is never done behind closed doors. It's never done in a vacuum. It is always there's always an element of influence. There's always an element of needing to study and understand and being aware, to think like a designer, to look at things as a designer sees them. And that's what this class is all about. You should be looking at things very differently at the end of the course than you are right at this point. Design incorporates aesthetics and function, so both go together. If it's only aesthetics, it can be self-expression, and something that is self-expressive is more fine art. It is not functional design. Design always has a useful, practical element to it. Design seeks order and not chaos, and that's very important. That again leads to the idea of beauty. People don't do ugly really well. In any situation, they'll prefer order. They will seek order, and it's basically part of being human. So anything that is ugly or chaotic or disorderly is not really true to what design is all about. And the last thing to consider is that like driving or riding a bike or even walking, as a designer, to do it well, the things that you take in to yourself in this class need to become intuitive. Good designers don't really have to think about exactly what they're doing all the time. They can think in a bigger picture mode, so they don't have to think, well, I need to balance this color with this color, I need to balance this smaller shape with this larger group of shapes, things like that. That kind of decision making becomes intuitive, and it's just something that you do. It's like when you're first learning to drive. You're thinking about everything. Okay, now I have to signal. Okay, it's 50 feet before the intersection. I have to slow down so I can make the right-hand turn. I have to remember that the accelerator's on the right and the brake pedal's on the left, and so forth. But after a time, all of that becomes reflexive and intuitive, and we can tootle down the street, eating French fries and playing with the radio and having conversations with people while we're driving. So that's the idea of design. When you're studying this, it eventually becomes not a set of principles to follow, like rules and laws and things like that. It becomes something that is ingrained and natural within you, and you just think and do without thinking about it. Elements 1 deals with the area of two-dimensional design, and so we are dealing with flat surfaces and images and things like that. We're dealing with patterns, and the forms and the colors and the textures are all put together in a two-dimensional understanding. Two-dimensional design pertains to, as I said, things that have two dimensions. Measure distance in two directions, height and width, a vertical aspect, a horizontal aspect. Basically, we're dealing with space, but it's flat. It's considered pictorial and not sculptural. So we're showing a photograph or a picture or a drawing or a sketch or a floor plan. Those are all two-dimensional understandings, and they can represent three-dimensional space, but they in themselves are not three-dimensional space. So we look at the architectural rendering here. And definitely we see perspective. We see a house in the distance and a tree up close, and then there's trees behind the house. So we get a sense of there being some distance between us. We're actually looking at something that represents real life. But this is a drawing, it's two-dimensional. And then we go over here and look at the Vasarely, and we see the patterning. And this is another kind of two-dimensional understanding. But again, it's got height and it has width. This has height, this has width. There is no sense of depth, really, except as an illusion. So two-dimensional design deals with flat pictorial space. Three-dimensional design is not the subject of this course. That's Elements 2. And, but you will find through your studies that two-dimensional design and three-dimensional design are necessary for your ability to bring spatial understanding, spatial designs into being. Three-dimensional design has measured distance in 3 directions. Three-dimensional is not the representation of a house or whatever as if it were an actual rendering or drawing. That's still two-dimensional. Three-dimensional is actual space. It is height, width, and depth. It's what you move around and move through. And so there's a horizontal aspect, there's a vertical aspect, and then the depth is the transverse aspect. And again, you're measuring distance in 3 directions. Three-dimensional space, three-dimensional design deals with true volume, and it's considered what we call sculptural rather than pictorial. So sculptural is in the round, it's three-dimensional, and one of the earlier known understandings of a piece of sculpture is the Code of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, and depicting Hammurabi giving the law and then the written law, and so everybody could see this, walk around this, and so forth, and understand the law, basically. So that's three-dimensional. Two-dimensional design, like three-dimensional design, involves elements and principles. It involves process. There's a process that goes on with design. That process takes time. In that process, you're going to develop ideas. You're going to evaluate ideas. That's where critical thinking comes in. Critical thinking is the ability to look at your ideas and make judgments as to, okay, is this solving the problem or not? Is it solving the problem to the best possible means, or is it falling short, and so forth? So that's the critical thinking. Problem solving. Design is often stated in terms of the client has a problem which needs to be solved. The client is expecting a baby and needs a nursery. That's the problem that needs to be solved. And the process involves a lot of revisions, because sometimes as you're going to think of something better in the process, because something will trigger a new idea or a embellishment of an idea, or maybe it's not quite right on, and so you're going to revise, or maybe you're going off in the wrong direction and you need to come back and revise and get back on track. So basically this is to say that design is not the first thing you land on is the best idea, and the first thing you land on is not necessarily executable in terms of being able to pull it off without a hitch. So expect revisions, expect the time, expect to be stretched, and maybe even feel uncomfortable sometimes, because these are new ideas, and as you take hold of them and incorporate them, there's going to be some growing involved, and that stretching sometimes may not be all that comfortable, but look to the end result. And don't expect things to be perfect right out of the gate, because things seldom are. And so go easy on yourself, allow yourself to engage in the process, allow yourself to evaluate your own work, and know what the problem is all about, and make adjustments as you go, course corrections. Okay, so that was basically the end of the overall picture, and now want to kind of go through the basic elements and principles of design. And with the understanding, of course, that these are universal to design and even fine art and so forth. Anything that's two-dimensional, fashion design in terms of the planning and the pattern making and things like that, graphic design, interior design and architecture when you're dealing with the actual planning stages, the elements and principles of design, of two-dimensional design, very much apply. And so this is the basic overview. And then through the course we're going to deal with each one of these in turn and flesh it out and bring you to a greater point of understanding and the ability to apply. So the elements, the formal elements of design are those things that are actually tangible, the things you actually work with. And formal does not mean that, they get dressed up and it's, black tie and tails. Formal refers to them being form. They're being, anything that has a form is an object or something that you can grasp or see or understand. We have billions of forms. Your car is a form, you are a form, your pencil is a form, your computer is a form, things like that. And anything that has form is something that we consider, shall we say, empirical, or it's understood as existing and real, as opposed to concepts and principles, which are ideas, but they need form to actually bring them to understanding. So the forms that we use to bring your ideas to life are these. In two-dimensional design, we have point. And point is basically a position in space. It's represented by a dot. It has no dimension. Point is not the same thing as the dot. The dot sits on the point. So point is basically an indicator of position. And as you move within a space, you change position, so you're at a different point in space. So point is basically where something is located in a given space. So that's the simplest of all the elements. The line concept is the connection between 2 points. Line has one dimension. It has length. There is a understood line between these 2 dots. There is a solid line here, and there's a broken line here. So to make a line, we start at point A and we move to a different position and end at point B. So to make a line, we have to start with a point, and so then we have to move that point or move from that point to a different position and land there, and then the line ends. So line is created by moving from point A to point B to point C and so forth. So line is a path of a point in motion, or the connection between two or more positions or points in space. Next up is shape. Shape is actually initially created by enclosing line, a line that actually will close back on itself. Line has one dimension. Shape is two-dimensional. It has height and it has width. And it is either bounded by a line, so it's either outlined, such as the various shapes in here, or it's totally filled and is differentiated from the area around it because of color, or it's lighter, or it's darker, or it's red, or it's blue, or it's light red, which would be pink, or dark red, which would be burgundy, but the area surrounding it might be a light green or something like that. So shape is a two-dimensional planar form bounded by a line. It's an enclosed line, or it's designated by a change in color. Next up is plane, which is a two-dimensional understanding, and but it's not necessarily tangible in terms of we see it. We have to be aware of it because there's foreground planes, midground planes, background planes, things like that. But it's an actual or understood area that's two-dimensional. It has height and width. It is flat. Planes are flat. A sphere has no planes. But a cube has 6 planes. So that gives you a clue. Planes actually are infinite. Any plane continues level out into space. And so, for instance, in any structure in your house or apartment, you have the interior walls and you have the exterior walls. They both sit on 2 different vertical planes. The top of your dining table represents a horizontal plane. The plane doesn't stop at the edges of the dining table. That same plane keeps going out into thin air and through the walls and down the street and so forth. That plane is a particular height off the ground plane and so forth. So plane is understood as conceptual. In other words, we understand it but don't see it, or we can actually see it represented as in a tabletop or a floor or a wall or a window. Volume in two-dimensional design is an illusion. It is because we don't have volume two-dimensionally. We need the third dimension in order to have true volume. So volume is an idea that we represent two-dimensionally by how we use point, line, shape, and plane. But volume is the idea of something having 3 dimensions, height, width, and depth. And as you can see, we've got, let's see, this shape, this shape, this shape, this shape, this long skinny shape, and then these 2 shapes all create this kind of the illusion of a transparent wireframe box. But the box, the drawing itself is two-dimensional, but it represents a three-dimensional object. So volume in two-dimensional design is an illusion. Then we have color, which is a perceptual change in chroma and value. Chroma is something actually having a sense of being colored, like red or blue or green. Value is lightness and darkness, and we'll talk more about that when we get to color. But color is one of those tangible elements, and it's a very important one. And color has a lot of aspects to it, and it is so complex an element that it has its own course. So you get to take color theory as well as the design theory courses. Then there's texture, which is quality of a surface. Texture is anything that has that's a solid object or a solid surface has texture. Something can be smooth, it can be rough, it can be soft, it can be hard. So texture is the quality or characteristic of a given surface. Space is measured distance. If we go 10 feet in one direction and 12 feet in the other, we have a 10 by 12 foot, piece of space two-dimensionally. Then maybe it's 12 feet tall, so now we have the 3 measured distances. We don't really understand space until we start measuring it. The relational elements in design are kind of how we relate the formal elements to each other. First one is direction, and there's basically 3 directions that go on in two-dimensional design. There's the vertical, which goes up and down or top to bottom. There's horizontal, which is side to side, and then there's diagonal, which is anything that's not vertical or horizontal. Vertical is what we'd call plumb. If you take a plumb line and drop it, that's vertical. It is basically perpendicular to the ground plane. Horizontal is parallel to the ground plane. It's side to side, and it is level. Anything a degree off of level is diagonal. Anything a degree off of vertical is diagonal. Position is also relational. We understand position of an element or a group of elements in a design space because of how it relates to the totality of the design space. And everything actually in design is relational. You have this shape relating to that shape, or this line relating to this line over here, or that shape over there. So position becomes very important. It's the formality of position is basically the point. The relational aspect of position is its relationship and location within the entire design. Space is also a relational element. Again, it's measured distance, but we have regular intervals between things, or we have different intervals between things. We have one thing closer to an element over here and further away from elements over there, and so forth. Another element is weight and gravity. They kind of relate to each other. Two-dimensionally, it is a perceived understanding. Some things are heavy, some things are lightweight. And weight and gravity deal with balance, stability, security, and things like that. As a point to make, as human beings, we really prefer things that are stabilized and balanced because we feel secure. We like to be secure. A frame is basically a frame of reference. It's the boundary, it's the outline, the perimeter of your overall design, and it's the starting place for structure, which is the foundation of the design. So a frame is the actual edge of the design, and within the frame is the picture plane. The picture plane is where you actually compose your design. So frame is the boundary of the picture plane, and the picture plane is everything within the frame. It's kind of like the frame is the fence, and the picture plane is everything inside the perimeter of the fence. And then I won't go into a lot of detail right now about these because we will get to them as we go, but there's organizing principles which include balance and pattern and scale and harmony and time and motion and so forth. And these all come into play as we relate forms to each other. And these are kind of big picture ideas. Then there's practical elements, which include meaning, representation, and function. Remember that design always needs to function in some way. It needs to communicate, it needs to facilitate, it needs to protect, it needs to get a person from point A to point B, whatever its purpose in life is. Design has a practical, functional element. So these all relate more to context and what things are all about. If we look at this cartoon, we see, first of all, that there is a drawn frame of reference all the way around, and it's a rectangular box, and it's designated by an outline. And then inside the box we see the form of a dog, the form of a tree, the partial form of a house, the form of a fence, a few shrubberies and trees, and a sign, and so forth. We see line, we see color in terms of black versus white, we see the idea of motion, which is one of these principles over here. Looking at the frame of reference, which is the previous screen that we talked about. It's the edge or the boundary of the design. Within it are all the active elements in the picture plane. Notice how there's nothing in here that is on the vertical or the horizontal. Every line that designates an edge here is diagonal. And that creates a certain anticipation and sense of energy and movement. And we've got the happy dog who's just about ready to come and slobber all over us. And that anticipation is aided by the lack of straight horizontal and horizontality or verticality in the cartoon. So there's a lot of aesthetic principles being applied in this cartoon whose function is basically to amuse and kind of be a snapshot, if you will, of a certain incident or characteristic of dogs in general or whatever. and all of these formal elements and relational elements and organizing principles and practical elements are in this cartoon, and it's only a cartoon. This is not Rembrandt, you know. So there you go. Starting with the formal elements, remember we had point, line, plane, shape, color, and texture, and volume, and space. We're going to take a look at line at this point, and this is actually going to lead up to your first project. Line is, after a point, the most basic understanding. It's the most basic of the formal elements. It's basically the one where we begin. As kids, we start drawing with lines. Our handwriting and our printing, as we're using block letters and things like that, they're all linear. And so we grow up, we are used to making lines. We'll draw a line in the sand, we'll keep our cars between two sets of lines on the freeway, things like that. So line is a very basic and necessary understanding. We can't make a shape unless we first start drawing a line. So line's pretty important. And it's actually a lot more complex than you ever thought it was, probably. It's complex because there's various types of line. The most obvious one is what we call an inscribed line. It's the actual hand-drawn visible line. And as we look at the Dürer drawing, we see the piece of foliage is actually described totally in line. We have outlines, we've got smaller bits of line here and there, all built up to create the illusion of this piece of foliage. And then again in the cartoon, we've got line creating the frame of reference, line describing what we understand to be clouds and people reaching heaven, and even the typeface here is a little bit more linear than it is shape-oriented. There's vertical lines, there's diagonal lines, there's horizontal lines, and so forth. So inscribed line is the line you actually make. Then there's implied line. And implied line suggests boundaries. It is understood because things line up or things repeat through a design that are going in the same direction. Implied line helps unify. It's one of those things that we don't see the line, it's understood, but it does become obvious if we understand that it's there. If we look at the Musha pattern, we see that each one of these points lines up on a straight line, and we can take a straight vertical line straight through down here and straight down here to the bottom. And we can take another line and come straight down, and it hits the same points. The bottoms of the sunflowers all line up on an invisible line. There's an invisible boundary, and that helps organize and unify that entire design. It helps bring order as opposed to chaos to the idea. We find alignment a lot in web pages, in printed pages, billboards, posters, anything to do with type. If you notice the top edges of all these photos line up, you can draw a straight line, and the side edges all line up, and it lines up with the text boxes. Over here there is an implication of line because of a margin or boundary between the active elements and then the edge of the design area or the frame of reference. There's an implied line here, goes down. There's an implied line here. Notice how the top of the photographs line up with the top of the text box, and the bottom of this text box lines up with the bottom of the photographs here. So that's all alignment. And so implied line deals with things basically moving into a position, an arrangement of position that is, shall we say, uniform and very orderly. And the third type of line is psychological line. Psychological line, in the textbook, the author describes it as psychic line. But psychological line is an understood connection between two or more elements in the design. So if we look at the Raphael drawing, we have a lot of, actually all three types of lines going on in each one of these, but if we look at it from a psychological point of view, he is looking straight up out of the picture plane. So that is a psychological line. Everybody else is making a visual connection to the central figure. Makes this guy the focal point, obviously. So each pointing of the eyes towards something within the design space is a psychological line. So we look at the Picasso, we have a couple who seem to have a close relationship, brother-sister, husband-wife, boyfriend-girlfriend, whatever they might be. But they're engaged in a conversation, perhaps, and now they've been interrupted. His attention is, there's a psychological line from him out of the picture plane. The psychological line between her and you is indicated by her direct stare. She's gazing out at you, the viewer, and you are now part of the situation that's being depicted in this drawing. She is drawing you in because she's looking directly at you as if she's saying, who are you, what do you want, what are you looking at, you know, whatever she might be saying. So that's the psychological line. The object of that kind of line does not need to be in the picture plane, as indicated here and here. Looking at these, we also see inscribed line, because we wouldn't see either of these images without line. And so the hand-drawn tangible line is all the way through, and it's even built up enough so that it starts creating areas of tone and which actually become shape. And here the same thing. We've got the outlines, the various weights and directions of the black line on the paper are what are actually describing all the edges of the two forms. Then there's also implied line in each one of them. If you look at the top of the heads of all the figures, except for this guy, they pretty much all land at the same place. The line on the architecture here basically is carried all the way across. If you look at the directionality of, say, from the ankles, actually starting way over here, we've got this lower right, upper left direction. It's picked up by the forearm, it's picked up in the calves, it's picked up in the thigh, it's picked up in the arm, it's picked up in the upper arm here. Opposing direction. Look how this goes across and connects with this. So there's a lot of diagonal implied lines, and then that line is again repeated here and here. So this is tons of implied lines. In the drawing of the couple, there's an implied line that's doing this, and it's making kind of an S-curve connecting, and it visually connects him with her. The bottom of her skirt moving up to the line of his pant leg, hitting the bottom of his coat and wrapping around, makes kind of an S-curve. There's an implied line here. Whatever they're leaning against or standing next to is actually continued straight down. There is a sense of wrapping here. You can draw a connecting implied line from the hand all the way up into the shoulder area, and it actually wraps up here and stops right up here. There's this line of the apron here, goes all the way up and starts wrapping around. So there's a lot of curved implied lines going on. If we look at this, it comes through on the top of his I don't know, socks or whatever they are, stockings, and goes all the way through and basically stops at his staff. So both of these drawings have psychological line, very obviously, inscribed line, or they wouldn't exist without it, and then implied line. And the implied line again helps organize the space and unify and bring everything together so it's all working together. So line is a very important thing in design. Between the three different types of line describes form. We create the edges of a shape through line. It encloses space. It's an enclosed line. A line that spirals is not a shape. A line that actually closes back and meets itself at its starting point is a shape. So it encloses space. We use line to divide space. As you start developing floor plans and so forth in other classes, you'll understand spatial divisions really well. Line will connect one element to another. That will be through implied line and psychological line, and actually even inscribed line can do that. You connect the dots. Line will control the viewer's eye as it moves through a composition or a space, and you can do that with any and all of the types of lines. Line three-dimensionally relates to the path of movement and a line of sight in the space or from the space into another space. Line always has a sense of movement to it. You can't create line without moving, so you have to change position, which involves actual movement. So there's always a sense of movement with line. Line, because it moves, always goes in a direction. Sometimes it changes direction and kind of flows or curves or spirals, but there's always a direction involved. And line is used to create passive or dynamic compositions and other things. In other words, things that are very active visually or things that are very quiet visually are achieved most of the time through how line is used. Types of inscribed line. We use line. We use inscribed line in two different ways. We use it as contour and we use it as gesture. Contour line describes edges. It indicates, okay, here's the edge of this shape or here's the edge of this form. And within contour line, we can have what we call lost and found contours, where we have implied connections and implied lines that actually function as the edge of a shape. And so the line kind of disappears and the brain kind of fills it in, like right here. This line on the shoulder is actually not directly meeting the collar on the coat. There is a gap there. Our mind, our brain, knows enough, is given enough information to be able to fill that in and understand that the form actually does continue. And there's also here, there's kind of a break in the shoulder and then picking up at the elbow. So these are called lost and found contours. So contour line describes edges or contours of a form, and they don't constantly need to be visually present. They can be implied. So inscribed line and implied line do work together. Gesture line shows direction or motion. Generally, it's the overall essence of an idea or of a shape. Like in creating this drawing, it's an oval shape, and so that's where it began. And then the contour line is starting to be built up loosely within the oval shape to describe the forms and how they're working together and start to tell a story. So the gestural lines are the oval understanding, and they're loosely drawn and they're lightly drawn, and then from there we build up the contour line to describe the actual forms. So two types of inscribed line are gesture, which is about movement and direction, and contour, which describes edges. And contour can fade in and fade out and be lost and found. Line has quality. Beyond the capability of shape or color or even surface texture, line quality is probably the most expressive issue of any of the formal elements. And we can be real passive, we can be real rigid and technical, we can be loose and flowing, we can be broken, we can be fast and energetic, we can be slow and methodical, and these are all expressed by line. And we can actually even build up line by hatching, which means making similar marks in one direction, and cross-hatching, going a different direction. We start building up tone. And we start building up the idea of shape and filled shape, colored shape. So we're going to compare Snoopy to one of Rembrandt's printmakers. Snoopy uses line and the printmaker uses line. And Snoopy uses line differently. He is totally outlined. And the line, the quality of the line is pretty much continuous. It does not change a whole lot. To create the shades, the sunglasses, we've built up line into dark tonality, and we've done the same thing here rather loosely. Obviously an implied line picks up here and then crosses behind or underneath the ear, and then picks up over here. It's kind of interesting that the ears are not holding up the glasses, but they're actually, the glasses are passing underneath. We humans cannot wear our glasses like that without looking funny. So he is very simply drawn and still, you know, fairly expressive, and the line is not exactly straight or precise. There's some wobbliness to it, which lends to the character of the drawing. Then we look at Rembrandt's etching, and we see hatching lines all over the place. We don't see a lot of inscribed line left over. What's happened is that the line that is built up as tone has been brought up against the edges or against the original lines, and so the only original lines we still have are up here in the architecture. But if we look at how all the tonalities build up, that's all linear. And of course line is the basis of etching, that printmaking process. It's all inscribed line. And then going different directions and see how we start getting kind of a textural effect on the fabric and so forth. When we build up line enough into tone, it actually becomes shape, and this is what we call a forced edge. In other words, it's no longer an outline, it is now an edge that's been created because we have taken the tonality, we build up the line enough so that it's now not outlined such as this is, but we see the shape of the hat because it's darker against the lighter ground behind it. And so the line there is, the inscribed line is totally gone. It has been forced out of our perception because tone has been built up and the line has disappeared into it. Notice also the psychological line, he's looking this direction and he's looking straight out at you. So say hi. Inscribed line, show the poster on the left because that's all computer generated, and so line doesn't have to be hand drawn. We can create linear elements on the computer, obviously. Even the signature on this is linear. Obviously the white stringy elements and even the typeface is linear in understanding. Even this box is linear in understanding. It is outlined. Then we have the shapes and the T, which kind of represents the horns of the bull, has a linear quality. Then we look at the Da Vinci piece and we see there's areas in there where we're actually seeing some of the gesture that the drawing is built on. But we see the inscribed line, we see the line built up, there's an implied understanding, tops of the hands, which is actually now designated by the inscribed line, and there's a common circular quality to this. Everything rotates around the center, And and then there's the psychological line because the guy's looking straight out at the viewer. You'll become very familiar with this type of inscribed line, the kind that has to be really precise and just so many inches long and so many, centimeters wide and things like that for your plan drawings and your schematics. And you can't get to the three-dimensional realm without having this kind of thing going on, but this is all linear. And notice how color has also been incorporated to express different aspects of this design, but it's all inscribed line, and it all sits within this picture plane, or sits within this frame of reference. And then again, all the active elements are in the picture plane. Notice also line is used to divide the space down here where all the information is. This is an illustration. It's a painting in watercolor and gouache, but notice all the inscribed line that goes on. Every horse, every shield, even the riders are outlined, and then the spears themselves are linear elements. And this is actually here to show the idea of the forced edge. In the drawing, and this is actually for an exhibition space about the environment of the human body, the obvious contour lines and their different qualities are involved. There's areas that are thinner, there's areas that are thicker, some are lighter, some are heavier. There's some kind of gestural lines thrown in, gestural line there. The figures themselves are gestured. They are not represented through contour line, but the architectural elements in the space in the exhibit are represented through contour line. But notice how in the fill here, the tonality is linear. You can see the pencil strokings, the hatching of the pencil, and then it starts getting more dense and gets a lot more dense, and all of a sudden the contour line has disappeared. It's now an edge, and whereas here the contour line is visible and then we have the fill becomes dark enough that it blends with the contour line and forces the edge to represent itself as an edge rather than be outlined by the contour line. This is a filled shape, and it is basically using the idea of forced edges to a great degree. So that's the idea of something being forced. It's when we talk about forced edges, those are what helps create the illusion of volume. As we look at the Degas drawing, we look at the top half of the horse and we don't see any outlines. If we look at the hooves and the pasterns and the, what are they called, fetlocks, he's still relying on line. It's like that area is unfinished. So down here we've got outline, especially right in here. But then as tonality is built up, we have forced edges and we have a greater sense of volume. When we are trying to create the illusion of volume two-dimensionally, it is important to understand that anything that's outlined, like the Snoopy drawing a few slides back, that's going to flatten space. That's not going to give us the illusion of volume because the form is totally outlined, and that total surround of line actually flattens the form and makes it a cartoon. Whereas we look at this Degas drawing and we see where the horse actually starts to be sculpted out of the paper. It's still a two-dimensional image, but it represents a volumetric thing. It represents a three-dimensional form throughout most of its existence. So the top half is very volumetric, and here it's very cartoon-like. Alignments. Implied line, obviously, this is a web page, screen capture, and there are in this two columns that are separated by gray gutters and surrounded by gray ground. But if you look at the baseline of all the letter forms, here, there's an implied line on which they sit. And then we can jump across the Great Divide, and this sits on an implied line. There's an implied line that starts here and goes straight across, picks up here and actually ends right about there. There's an implied line here creating the margin, and an implied line here creating the margin. All these bullets, the dots, actually line up and center themselves on an implied line. Then there's a gutter, there's an indent, and then so all the left edges of those lines of type line up against an implied line. So implied line makes things easier to understand, easier to read, makes things look better, makes things visually appealing. We like implied line, it's a good thing. Even in our postmodern times, implied line is good. In these posters, implied line is very much evident and helps keep the space organized. It does flatten space in terms of how things are aligned, so that we have the line here and we have an implied line here, and I've actually sort of diagrammed or illustrated some of the implied lines by using inscribed lines. So you can see how everything is lined up and relates, so that this by its position relates to the bigger piece, and this by its position does the same thing. And notice the implied lines on the bottoms of the letters and the lines of type, and how there's a boundary here that the type does not break out of, and so forth. Keep space really organized. And we see that in various cultures, various times, implied line has existed. So the Chinese calligraphy is from a few centuries ago in China. And notice that all the characters we see, first of all, have a gestural sense. So in their inscription of line, they're very gestural. But notice how they are aligned, centered on a vertical line. And this line is centered on a vertical line, and then the smaller one is also centered on a vertical line. And notice how there's an implied line here. So this and this are in the same vertical relationship to the top edge of the piece, and then there's an implied line here. And this is a few centuries ago, different culture. This is from the modernist movement in design in Europe, which was early and mid 20th century. And notice, first of all, the diagonals, but notice the implied line, and notice all the implied line, how the repeated directions in one direction create a sense of movement. You start with the line here, you cross the gap visually and pick it up, and you actually keep going. The thinner lines line up with each other, then go in the opposite direction. There's repeated implied lines and so forth. So implied line here, two aesthetic principles, different cultures, different centuries. Better Homes and Gardens from the 1950s, repeated direction, horizontal all the way through. And we look at an illuminated manuscript illustration that depicts the coronation of Charlemagne, and he was, what, about 300? Somewhere, he was like medieval times. And there's directions repeated here. Obviously, Better Homes and Gardens, it's all horizontal. And in the letter forms themselves, there's repeated verticals. And here we have the repeated curve, they're repeated on a smaller scale here. It's repeated over here. Then we have this curve repeated, and in the flow of the hands into the elbow, we have the vertical here lining up with the white staff here. Obviously we have psychological line, we have inscribed line going on, but the repeated directions are the things that I really wanted to point out here. So we have use of implied line in medieval times, and we have use of implied line about 100 years ago, or 60 or 70 years ago here. And again, in the Degas drawing, the William Morris piece, the implied line, the repeated direction. Notice the diagonals create a sense of movement. So the directionality of the trees recurs throughout the drawing, and so it unifies all these forms together, and then we have this repeated flow. If you look at how the stems are working in this wall covering or this fabric piece, you see how there is a flow that's repeated all the way through, and there's a movement from upper left to lower right. Notice also this is unfinished. Some is colored, some is just drawn in, and some is still in the basic formation stage, which I think is kind of interesting. If you get to the Getty Museum, the Getty Center, if you're able to do that, you'll see this actual painting. But if we look at it, first of all, let's look at it in terms of implied line. The composition that the figures make is a triangle. And so we have the dad's head, and then we have the child, and then the other child. And so there's this kind of triangular shape going on. We also have implied line as things pick up. The architecture, the chair rail picks up on her little sash, goes kind of across the line of his fingers and picks up over here, and actually picks up over here. She is leaning in to her dad, who's also leaning. And then we change direction, and psychological line between her and him, between her and her. I think that's I'm not sure if the pink designates the girl and the blue designates the boy, because there was one point where young children, boy or girl, were dressed in gowns. But there's implied line here. Notice the arm, and then coming up the skirt, picking up in the forearm here. So there is implied line, there's psychological line, and a couple places where inscribed line is actually used. But the big thing about this is psychological line, and that's actually helping to tell the story and characterize these family members. This young one is addressing you, the viewer, directly, so again, say hi. And here too, psychological line, she's looking straight out at the viewer. And even here, psychological line is being used. If we look at the dad and the mom, they're looking out at you. The toddler with the big mouth is kind of looking askance, as he often does. The teenager, the son, is looking straight out at you. The dog is contemplating his next sip, and she's kind of rolling her eyes. But again, psychological line helps tell the story and characterize each of these characters. This is really cool because this is a photograph, and so it was not created from the ground up, it was actually captured. But even in photography, you will have aesthetic principles in action. And psychological line, obviously the rugby ball is the center of attention, and everybody is psychologically connecting to it in some way or another. Notice also the implied line going on. The hand down pointing at the ball, her arm coming down pointing at the ball, her arm coming here, the hand going up into the ball, this arm coming here, and there's a visual connection between that forearm and that forearm, and so forth. So there is implied line all over the place. There is psychological line all over the place. This was a photograph taken of a benefit women's rugby game. They were playing in their prom dresses. It was a benefit for, I think, breast cancer, and I think it was in Britain. It appeared in Sports Illustrated a few years ago. Another thing about line is the idea of explicit line. And explicit line is a little more of a concept. It's a principle about line rather than being a type of line. Explicit line is involved where you have definition or delineation between the figures and the background, either by use of inscribed line or by use of solid edge that doesn't disappear into the background. So if we look at the two characters in the Daumier drawing, they are fully represented. You can actually cut them out. You can take scissors and cut them out and have them fully represented. There's no part of either of these figures that blends into the background. But there's no outline. It's differentiated by edge, and the edge is just very visible and explicitly stated, precisely stated, exactly stated from start to finish. In this drawing, the inscribed line is used to state the foliage and separate it from the background. So explicit line is edge recognition, whether it is a forced edge, as in the Daumier drawing, or it's an actual outline all the way across. The one place where explicit line doesn't exist is right here, and right here, and right here. And that tells us that these are, and also here and here, that tells us that these are snippets of something larger, whereas this is the entire thing that's being communicated. These are parts of the thing that's being communicated, and these are like details. So thus we have the lack of explicit line here because we don't see the entire form. So explicit line by virtue of edge recognition all the way around, and explicit line by virtue of an outline all the way around. So the final analysis, which means we're going to look at something and review it and analyze it. So what do you see? This is a William Morris illustration for the Canterbury Tales, which he was very well known for. He was not only interior designer, furniture designer type, but he was an illustrator and loved doing books. If we look at this in terms of what are the formal elements, we have line, inscribed line going on. We also have implied line. We have psychological line. She's looking at this. We have shape, obviously. There's tons of different shapes in here. We have color, which is formal element. We've got red and blue and yellow, a little bit of green, so it's pretty much primary triad dominating on the red. We also color-wise have white and black. We have texture, which is the pattern, but it's also the sense of everything having some surface nubbliness or something going on. There's certain surface characteristics either by virtue of pattern or just by virtue of brushwork and technique. Texture in her hair, different from the texture that appears here because of the pattern and so forth. We have a defined frame of reference, which are the edges of the image, and we have things going on within the picture plane, which is the composition itself. So we have space defined in 2 dimensions. We do have the illusion of volume for a variety of reasons, but there's also flatness to it, so it's definitely seen as an illustration. There is a foreground plane, so she's in the foreground standing in front of the bed, which is standing in front of the lady in the background who's in front of the back wall. So there are various planes of understanding. This curtain is on a forward plane. This curtain is on a plane that's further back in space, and so forth. So as we look at this image, there's all of these things going on. So the idea is that when you start looking at things, it's not like you're just, listening to what I'm telling you, how I'm instructing you, and looking at a few images. As you turn off your computer and go watch some television or read a magazine or go surfing and look at websites and things like that, blogs, look at implied line. Look for instances of inscribed line. Look for instances of psychological line. And as you go about your daily tasks, your daily routines, look at things from this point of view. Look for these elements, look for these relationships, and you'll start seeing as a designer. And so if you start seeing as a designer with intention, then it becomes inherent, it becomes habitual. And that would be one of the goals of this course, is to actually get you to see things differently down the road a few weeks than you're actually seeing now.